Today on the newscast, is Bashar Al-Assad trying to rebuild Syria's chemical weapons program? And what is Israel doing about it? Find out next. Hey folks, Erick Stakelbeck here. Welcome to the Watchman Newscast. When we think of weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East today, of course, we think first and foremost of the Iranian regime and its drive to acquire nuclear weapons. But the Washington Post issued a very interesting report today outlining how Bashar Al-Assad, the Syrian dictator, is attempting to restart his chemical weapons program, and Israel has something to say about it. Now, before I get into it, I just want to encourage you to subscribe to the Watchman News channel right here on YouTube and click the notification bell so you get alerts every time a new video is posted. Folks, we are on top of all of the latest breaking Middle East news and how it affects you no matter where you live. So let's get right into it. Again, the Washington Post reporting today that Israel carried out 2 airstrikes against Syrian military facilities where Bashar al-Assad's regime was attempting to restart its chemical weapons program. Now, let me get this out of the way. I also am not a Washington Post fan. I know most of our viewers probably are not as well, but this is a pretty well-sourced story and has credible details, in my view, of what has gone down in this scenario of Syria driving once again, perhaps, for chemical weapons. First, the details on the Israeli airstrikes, and then a broader analysis. Here's exactly what went down according to this Washington Post piece, which is a pretty long piece and also quotes Western and U.S. intelligence officials, unnamed, of course. They wanted to stay anonymous, but they shared some pretty important information here. Number one, airstrike on June 8th, 2021, just a few months ago, targeted 3 sites overall, sites near Damascus, the Syrian capital, and also the city of Homs. Now, Homs is about 100 miles north of Damascus. It's the 3rd largest city in Syria, and apparently these Israeli airstrikes targeted chemical weapons facilities in and around these 2 cities. Reportedly, the Syrian regime is trying to import materials that could make nerve gas. Now, if you remember, back in August 2013, Assad used chemical weapons against anti-Assad forces outside of Damascus, nerve gas in particular, and some 1,400 people were killed in that chemical weapons attack carried out by the regime of Bashar al-Assad. The images were horrific. Many women and children, civilians, killed in this deadly attack. So that's number one. And at the time, the international community, led by at the time the Obama administration, pressured Assad to give up his chemical weapons program. And it seemed that he did exactly that. International inspectors came in. He renounced chemical weapons because basically he wanted to stay in power. Bashar al-Assad was very concerned of being overthrown, some kind of international effort coming together to overthrow him. Remember the infamous red line that Barack Obama drew that Assad crossed without hesitation using chemical weapons? Well, that is a trip down memory lane to those days, the earlier days of the Syrian civil war. Bottom line, Assad supposedly gave up his chemical weapons program, but clearly he retained some of those chemical weapons. And President Trump, fast forward a few years, carried out 2 airstrikes during his 4-year term against Assad targets because Bashar al-Assad once again was using chemical weapons. At least 200 chemical weapons attacks carried out by the Assad regime after he supposedly renounced chemical weapons. So it should come as no surprise today that he is attempting to revive his chemical weapons program. Israel, by the way, has had no comment about these reported airstrikes against those Syrian chemical weapons facilities over the past almost 2 years. Again, March 2020 and June 8th, 2021. But here's the broader picture, folks. Those are some of the details for you. Here is the broader picture. And the big question, number one, is why would Assad want chemical weapons at this point? He's basically prevailed in the bloody, horrific Syrian civil war with the help, of course, of the Iranian regime and Hezbollah and Russia, which came riding to the rescue. and entered Syria in force back in September 2015. So Assad has recovered most of the country. He has prevailed at great cost in that Syrian civil war. He used chemical weapons against his internal opponents, as I mentioned, during the early years, especially of that Syrian civil war. So if he has prevailed, and the anti-Assad forces really aren't a threat to overthrow him at this point, why does he want chemical weapons once again? Folks, real simple, Israel. The original reason that Bashar al-Assad built up a chemical weapons program was to use them in a potential war against Israel. Remember, Israel and Syria are still technically in a state of war, and they have been for decades. So Assad is a sworn enemy of Israel. He's hosting Israel's greatest enemies on his soil. So he wants that chemical weapons capability, number one, to ward off any potential threats to his rule in the future and a potential second civil war breaking out someday down the road. But number two, he could very likely use these chemical weapons as a deterrent with Israel. Hey, over the past several years, as we've documented many times here on the newscast, Israel has carried out at least hundreds of airstrikes against targets inside Syria, in particular Iranian Hezbollah and Iranian associated targets inside Syria, which, by the way, made these strikes in March and June that we talked about against those chemical weapons facilities very interesting to intelligence experts because, again, usually Israel, if it strikes in Syria, it's against Iranian assets. But in those two strikes, Syrian military facilities were specifically targeted. So that kind of raised the eyebrows of intelligence experts around the world who observed this. But one reason, clearly, Assad would like that chemical weapons capability as a deterrent and to threaten Israel with it if need be, God forbid, which brings us to the second broader point. Hey, a lot of people here in the newscast, when we talk about Syria and Israeli airstrikes in Syria, they bring up Isaiah 17. Hey, we look at things through a biblical lens here on the Watchman Newscast. Isaiah 17 is very clear. It says that Damascus one day will cease to be a city and it will become a ruinous heap. Now, no one wants to see that happen, obviously. I'm just telling you what the Bible says. That's exactly what Isaiah 17 says, folks. And if you look out at history, Damascus is one of the oldest inhabited cities in world history. It has never been completely destroyed. Even the Mongols did not raze Damascus completely to the ground. Even during this horrific civil war over the past decade, Damascus has not been destroyed. Isaiah 17 has a pretty dire warning about that city, and Bashar al-Assad has not shown himself to be the wisest leader, I guess you could say. So you could see him making a serious bad move that would precipitate a very nasty repercussion for Damascus. We'll see as the prophetic chess pieces continue to move. We'll keep an eye on that. But clearly, when we're talking about this, the fact that he's trying to restart a chemical weapons program certainly has to get your attention. And the last point, in terms of the broader view of what this all means, hey, think about what this says to the Iranian regime. Okay, Israel acted against Assad's chemical weapons program, which is a WMD program. These are, again, weapons of mass destruction. So Israel, let's look at the track record real quick, folks. Acted against Assad's chemical weapons program recently. Rewind to 2007. Israel targeted Syria's nuclear weapons program with airstrikes. And rewind even further to 1981 when the Israeli Air Force, of course, took out Saddam Hussein's nuclear reactor at Osirak in Iraq. What does that tell you? Does anyone out there watching right now really think that Israel will allow a regime that is devoted to Israel's destruction to acquire the weapons that would enable it to do exactly that? No way. Under no circumstance will Israel allow Iran to acquire nuclear weapons. Will that take the form of airstrikes? Will it take the form of sabotage? We don't know. But folks, I can assure you that is a non-starter for Israel. That is one issue that Israelis across the political divide can agree on. We cannot allow this barbaric regime, which is committed to our destruction, to acquire nuclear weapons. So, Iranian regime, You do the math. Hey folks, quick reminder, this Wednesday, a Watchman Newscast live stream. I'm sure we'll be talking about this pretty explosive, no pun intended, report about Israel targeting Syria's chemical weapons program. Join us between 4 and 5 p.m. Eastern Time here on the channel on Wednesday, December 15th, and bring your questions for the Q&A session. I am sure we will have some questions about Isaiah 17. Hey, thanks so much for joining us here today on the newscast. Until tomorrow, God bless you. And remember, never hold your peace. Hey everyone, thanks for checking out the Watchman Newscast. If you enjoyed this episode and want to see more, make sure you go ahead and hit the like button, click subscribe, and tap the bell icon to turn on notifications for new Watchman Newscast episodes every weekday.